My name's Mark Chapman, so I'm a professor in biological sciences, so my office is just upstairs, and I study plants about 95% of the time, and I'm interested in their genetics, their genomes, and their DNA. And these lectures about domestication, there's actually a block of lectures I give to a third year module called Genetics and Evolution. And we do 3 blocks of lectures, and each one is assessed by one piece of coursework. So I've just literally this week finished the first block. We had 3 weeks about domestication. So this is just going to be a whistle-stop tour of some of the kind of things we talk about in those lectures. So what is domestication? So we always start, first lecture is I like to just ask the students, what do you think domestication is? And they say, well, planting plants and moving animals around and things. And that's kind of cultivation. That's just moving things and putting them where you want. So like having a nice forsythia in your garden is because you put it there, but that doesn't mean you domesticated it. So domestication is adapting the wild plants and the wild animals for human use. 99.9% of everything is adapted for human use, but there is interesting stories of like an ant that's domesticated a fungus or something like that. But this is what we're sticking to in this block of lectures. So why is domestication happened, and what kind of changes have happened? So we think about most domesticated species, we often think about food, so all of these fruits and vegetables, but we've got things that were domesticated for their fibres, so cotton or hemp and things like that. We've got domesticated species that have compounds in them that we're interested in, so it might be a dye or it might even be a medicine. And then we've got animals being domesticated to pull a plough, or we can eat them, or greyhounds for racing and things like that. So we've got a bunch of different things about why things were domesticated. And so what changed? Well, it might be the taste or the texture of the thing. It might be the fibres become stronger. Wild cotton, for example, has really, really tiny little weak fibres. But domesticated cotton, obviously, most of us tend to wear jeans at least once or twice a week. You can see how strong that cotton is. But then there's domestication, like increasing the amount of the part we want. So it might be some sort of chemical, whether that's an antibiotic or something. And then domestication of animals, they tend to be more muscular, but also more tame. We've sort of bred out the wildness in some of them. But there's other traits as well. So it's not just about this kind of final use. It's not just about the bit we eat or just about these other things. We've got plants that are easier to harvest. We've got animals that they're more tame, they behave better essentially. They might store better, and we've bred out a lot of anything that's toxic or even just unpleasant to eat. So when we think about harvesting, so these are wild tomatoes. This is a species called Solanum pimpinellifolium, and the tomatoes are about a centimetre across, maybe a little bit smaller. These are all obviously domesticated tomatoes, and you can imagine that a human may have seen a slightly larger tomato and would have collected those, and that would be more efficient than collecting lots and lots of smaller ones. This is a safflower. It has really big spines on its leaves, and so this is the wild one, but the domesticated one, we bred out those spines so you don't get attacked when you're harvesting it for its oil or its or dyes from the flowers. This is bread wheat, so if you had bread at all today in any form, you had bread wheat. But these are kind of earlier and earlier domesticated wheats, and then this is a wild wheat. So you can see that the domesticated one has a much larger amount of food actually per plant. And then these are 2 different types of rice, and there's a trait here called shattering. And so most domesticated rice, if you shake it, the seeds stay on the plant, but most wild rice, when you shake it, the seeds fall off. And that makes sense, because in the wild, the plant needs to disperse its seeds, so it would be bad to be non-shattering. But the domesticated type, we've bred out the shattering genes, and so we have plants that we can just pull the heads off. We're not picking up the grains off the floor like we would have been doing 10,000 years ago. These are just some animal examples. So obviously wild animals, they tend to be pretty poorly behaved compared to our domesticated counterparts. So dogs being domesticated from wolves is a nice example. And then there's a wildish bull there. But for a typical cow that we would get milk or meat from, we've bred out the horns and we've bred out some of that behaviour. And then there's a lot of beans and other legumes that are actually toxic to a certain degree, because in the wild they don't want animals eating the seeds. The seeds are the next generation. So we've bred out some of these horrible toxic or even just distasteful compounds. So here's a quiz that I always do with the undergraduates. So I've got some wild species here, and I'd like you to guess what the domesticated counterpart might be. So Top left, can anyone guess what that is? That scale bar is about a centimetre, so it's about 1.5, 2 centimetres across. I mean, people quite often guess tomato, which is the same family, but it's actually an aubergine. So the wild aubergine is smaller than a golf ball. It's quite bitter and quite kind of jelly-like inside. Top right, it looks a bit like a dandelion, but it's not. But it's closely related to a dandelion. Same plant family.
Lettuce.
Absolutely. That's a wild and domesticated lettuce. Bottom right, this one shouldn't be too difficult, so we'll go over that quite quickly. That's just a wild and a domesticated sheep. This one in the middle, that's often found along roadsides in the UK. Quite different from its domesticated counterpart, wild and a domesticated cabbage. Bottom left, we've just got beans there, and that's not a very exciting example. But my personal favourite is this one on the left here. Does anyone know what that might be the wild counterpart of? This is a centimetre, so this is about 4, 5, 6 centimetres long.
Carrot.
Sorry?
Carrot.
No, not carrot.
Asparagus.
No, but people often say that. That's the cool thing about this, that's corn. And that's to scale. So the wild corn has these tiny little heads with a few seeds on them, and I've got some here that I'll pass around. So this is just called a species called teosinte, it's from Mexico. So each of these kernels has lost its very hard coating through domestication. But the fact that this is to scale just blows my mind. And that's about 10,000 years of divergence. And as humans diverged from chimpanzees 6 million years ago, so I would argue that we look more similar to a chimpanzee than those two types of corn do, the wild and the domesticated. And another nice example is I just talked to you about the domestication of cabbage, but all of these species are actually the same species. They're all domesticated from the same wild species. So kohlrabi has its swollen stems. We've got kale with the leafy part we eat. Broccoli, obviously, we know what we eat with broccoli. Brussels sprouts, these are buds on the side of the plant, and they actually have just kind of got very large swollen buds. And we've got cabbages and cauliflower as well. All of these domesticated from one wild ancestor in maybe 6,000 years, maybe 7,000 years. That's kind of our best guess at the moment. So just a few thousand years is not a very long time in evolutionary sense, but massive morphological changes associated with that. And another example, dogs is a really nice example. So we've got wolves, and basically all wolves are, within a few degrees of each other. All wolves look the same. But domesticated dogs, we've got large ones, small ones, we've got yappy little ones, we've got really docile ones, we've got greyhounds that are super fast, we've got St Bernards that will go up a mountain with brandy around its neck to save your life. But all of this diversity comes from a very small, from one origin. Dogs are about 15,000 years ago, probably. Where did it happen? Well, a lot of plants were domesticated in what we call the Fertile Crescent. So there's this region around here in the Middle East. So it's got the northern part of the Nile and these two rivers here, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And all of these plants, really big, important plants, wheat, barley, rye, flax, chickpeas and peas, and the animals as well, goats, cows, pigs and sheep were all domesticated there. And there's a bunch of smaller ones as well, lentils, carrots, dates, walnuts, a big diversity of stuff, all from a very small part of the world in the Middle East. It's not the only place we think domestication happened. So if we just look at all of the orange patches here, there's different parts of the world where domestication happened. And we've got rice, soybean, apricots in China, beans and yams in New Guinea. There's another species of rice, African rice, that's actually domesticated separately from Asian rice. So when you buy your rice, you're buying Asian rice that came from Southeast Asia. But in parts of Africa, there's a completely separate species that was domesticated. We've got a bunch of other things, common beans, potatoes, a few in North America, but not very much, but sunflowers and strawberries are pretty big crops. What's interesting is a common bean, there's actually two origins. So wild common bean grows all around this area, and separately, in these two different places, a domestication event happened. So we've got an ancient spread of this species all throughout South and Central America, and in two parts of the world, humans actually domesticated the same species. And then the other example I gave was the rice, but these are not two origins of the same rice, these are separate species that were domesticated independently. So why did it happen in those places? Well, we don't think that every species can be domesticated. We think there's certain constraints, and that's part of the work I do in my lab, but I won't go into it in any detail. But one interesting example, so this is what I always tell the students, take this home and tell your housemates about this. So zebras are incredibly vicious, and they actually injure more zookeepers every year than tigers do. They're that bad. And there's a very small difference between a zebra and a horse. The zebras have their eyes just slightly further back on their head, which gives them better peripheral vision. So if you're trying to tame one of these animals, and you go up behind it with a rope, and you try and put it around its neck, the zebra will more likely be able to run away than the horse. So it might just be a tiny little morphological difference like that meant that horses were domesticated and zebras weren't. And it might be about their genetics as well. So this is a project that I've been working on, not this specifically, but it's something I'm interested in. So almonds and oaks, they're trees. They're kind of bitter in the wild. They're probably not very tasty, but there's good evidence that thousands of years ago people were eating wild almonds and wild oaks. But the bitterness gene, there's a single bitterness gene in almond, so you just need a mutation to knock that out, and then you get non-bitter almonds. But in oaks, there's multiple genes, so you need to knock it out, knock it out, knock it out, knock it out, knock it out to get a less bitter oak. So it might be something about how many genes control certain different traits. And the almond oak example is just like an example that's been talked about, but there's other things that could be going on about the number of genes and where they are in the genome. And there's things about certain animals, so they might just have a very, very slow generation time. They might have a very specific diet or a certain disposition. And I'm sure we'd all like a domesticated panda around our houses. I think that would be gorgeous. But how much bamboo would you need to keep that going? It would just be too difficult. I don't think any human would ever try and domesticate a panda without having to have endless amounts of bamboo first. But it also, if you remember from the map, I talked about there's two big rivers in the northeast and the Nile in the south. So probably domestication took place in those places because of not just the species that were present, but the environment as well. So very fertile soils, very close to waterways, is going to make the cultivation of plants much more easy. And actually, despite only a very small amount of the world being where we think domestication happened, close to 90% of humans actually speak a language that's derived from those two of these tiny parts of the world, Southeast Asia in China and the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. So this suggests that these populations of humans have been more successful, they've spread around the world and they've taken over, and now almost 90% of humans speak languages that are derived from there. So how do we know where domestication took place? Well, first of all, we assume it took place relatively close to where the wild ancestors live. So we've got two examples here, and this is just where the wild soybeans live. So red is the wild soybean, and the blue and the green is not a bit blurry, but that's where very early domesticated types and archaeological remains have been found. And then southwest South America, well, western South America, this is where wild tomatoes live. And all of these places, we've got some evidence that this is probably where domestication took place. But these are quite big parts of the world, the whole of eastern China and the whole of the west of South America. So we can actually use genetics to try and pinpoint a bit more about exact locations. The other example I wanted to give is just about animal domestication. So again, there's very good fossilized bones and bits of animals and jaws and things like that, bits of teeth, that can tell us that if it looks like a modern domesticated type, we can say that's probably an early example of a domesticated type. And again, for pigs and sheep and llamas, we've got these dots just show where the earliest archaeological remains have been found, and the grey is the distribution of where the wild species is found. So pigs is an interesting example. It looks like it was domesticated in two places. Sheep, we already mentioned the Fertile Crescent, and this is the wild distribution of wild sheep. And then llamas down again in South America, but again the archaeological remains are within. But like I said, how can we actually pinpoint a bit more about where this domestication took place? So what we do is we use genetics. So you can sequence genes in the genome, you can use other types of markers that tell you how similar or how different the different types are, and you can make these types of diagrams. We call them a phylogenetic tree. And basically it groups things based on similarity, a bit like a family tree would do. So all of these types are domesticated maize. And they all go back, we've got red ones, then orange, and then grey, etc., etc. But they all go back to one point. So we know that domestication happened once. We haven't got two different groups. We've got one big group with a single origin. And what we can do is we can say, right, what's the closest relative that's wild that isn't a domesticated type? And here it happens to be this subspecies, which is called Parviglumis, which is the one I just passed around. And actually, if we look at the distribution of subspecies Parviglumis, it's actually a tiny part in southern Mexico. So even though there's probably archaeological remains all around Mexico, actually with genetics we can pinpoint this tiny little area down here. So really get precise estimates of where domestication took place. So how did it take place? Well, we assume that humans didn't have any sort of goal. There was no, I'm going to pick this one because I want tomatoes to be bigger, or I'm going to pick this one because that cow is better behaved than that cow, or something like that. It's more about, this is the one I ate, I've spilt the seeds, or I've pooped out the seeds, and these are the ones that are going to go pass on to the next generation. So it can just be as simple as picking certain types and then going through the life cycle in some sort of encampment or something like that. But it was at a time of unpredictable climate, so about 10,000 years ago. We've got the end of the last glaciation. And humans, the populations had started growing, and there was a loss of big game. So large animals were starting to be killed and going extinct. So there was a gradual change, but a very directional change towards what we see today in our domesticates. And this is why I say gradual, because we've got very good archaeological remains of certain species. So we've got these 4 different types of cereals. We've got barley, 2 types of wheat and rice. And this is the percentage of grains that have been found that were non-shattering through time. And you can see the time it takes to go from being basically 100% shattering to 100% non-shattering. We're talking about 2, 3, 4,000 years. We're not talking about a sudden mutation and then, within 20 years everything was different. We're talking about very slow changes over time, over thousands of years. So we've got non-shattering, we've got grain size there as well. And again, a couple of thousand years to get these differences. But like I said, a large proportion of humans across the world now actually speak languages that are derived from these parts of the world. And that's because we assume that domestication allowed humans to, they had a more predictable and a more reassured type of amount and type of food when they wanted it. So they were all these different types of advantages compared to neighbouring hunter-gatherers. And that's probably why in the Fertile Crescent we've got early evidence of metal tools, we've got writing, we've got empires being built, we've got evidence for armies as well more recently. So in these parts of the world, being able to actually have a predictable amount of food or more food allowed the population to grow and allowed people to take on different trades and different expertise. So what happens during domestication? So this is kind of the next bit of the lectures where I talk about genetic changes. So lots of wild species in the world right now have lots of genetic variation, but we lose genetic variation as we go through the domestication process. So early domestication, we breed out certain traits, so weedy traits and things like that. But then later on, we breed for kind of uniformity. So when you go to Sainsbury's, all of the aubergines are the same size, all of the peppers are the same size, they're all the same colour, and so on and so on. So we've bred out a lot of variation that's actually really important to be present in the wild. And this is just an example. This is very old data actually, but this is when before I came to Southampton, I did this project. This is data from sunflowers, and we just measured how much genetic diversity was there in wild, early domesticated and improved sunflower types. And you can see there's a drop over these two sorts of transitions. But what we can do is we can compare what the plants look like or what the animals look like, and we can zoom in on what genes might involve. So this is wild corn on the left, teosinte, this is domesticated corn on the right. And there's a particular gene that is highly expressed in domesticated corn that stops the branches forming. So there's low expression in all of the nodes in the wild, and then an increased expression here, about double the expression, and it stops branches forming. So we go from a highly branched plant with lots of small heads, with each one with a little few seeds on, to this kind of unbranched plant with 1 or 2 cobs forming on every plant. But it's not just about expression changes. This is a difference between wolves and dogs. There's a particular gene that's involved in breaking down starch, and all wolves had a single copy of this. So in this example, they sequenced the genome of 35 wild wolves, and there was 1 copy of this gene. Whereas in the domesticated dogs, there was at least 4, up to about 30 copies of this gene. So multiple copies of a gene that breaks down starch. And that causes an increase in gene expression, an increase in protein activity, and it does kind of accompany the fact that a wolf will largely eat meat almost 100% of the time, but domesticated dogs, they probably, during the time of domestication, were given scraps. It might have been old bits of corn cobs, it might have been whatever was left. It's unlikely that humans would have spent so much time catching some sort of animal and then giving it to their dogs. So the dog diet changed, and that caused a genetic change as well that we can pick up now by just sequencing the DNA of the dogs. So what does all this mean in terms of what we eat now and what we're going to eat in the future? So once we understand the genes that control these traits, we can breed for resilient crops by using genetic information from their wild ancestors. We can do genetic modification. I'm not against it. It's just a much more rapid way of crop breeding, essentially. But there's something called neo-domestication. So taking a wild species with some really important trait, so let's say it's salt tolerant. It might be a salt tolerant wild tomato or something like that. So it hasn't got all of the alleles to make it domesticated at all, but it's got this really important trait, salt tolerance. And what we can do is, because we know what the domestication genes were, we can take our wild tomato and we can knock out certain genes or add in certain genes to take it from looking like a wild tomato to looking like a domesticated type. But that domesticated type will then be salt tolerant. And this is just the example I want to give. So this is a stress tolerant tomato. So again, the wild tomato was salt tolerant, and they put in a handful of genes, about 6 or 7 genes, a couple of genes that increase the fruit size. So you can see it goes from this tiny fruit to these fruits that are, at least 2, 3, 4 times bigger. And it increased the amount of flowers on each stem as well, because all of these flowers are going to eventually be pollinated and turned into a tomato. So instead of having 6, 8 or 10, it's got about 30 or 40 flowers. So we've got triple the fruit size, 10 times more fruits, and there was a change in a gene as well that is involved in lycopene, which is very good for human health. But the neo-domesticated tomato was then salt tolerant because the wild ancestor had been salt tolerant. That wasn't bred out. Okay, that's me done. That's just a snippet of everything. It's literally 5 lectures crammed into 20 minutes. If you have any questions about that, you're welcome to ask me. I'm program lead for biology and zoology, so I know about what modules the students have to do and how things work. If it's a question specifically about admissions, it's best to talk to James.